Wow. Thank you to everyone who is here. Welcome to this session on localization in video games. My name is Annalise Finnegan. I think we all know each other. I direct the master's program in translation and interpreting here at NYU. And very importantly, our session today is held in collaboration with the Association of Language Companies, Bridge. So I'm really delighted to be joined by Kathleen Diamond, who is the chair and the guiding light of the ALC Bridge Committee. And if you haven't heard me talk about ALC Bridge before at one of these events, it is an organization that helps language professionals and students alike to identify, explore, and land career-oriented jobs in the language services field. So it is a Venn diagram of employers, educators, and students, all within the language services. Before I introduce our speaker, I'll turn the mic briefly to Kathleen if you'd like to share anything about the bridge.
Thank you so much, Annalise. It's always so terrifically wonderful to be in your classrooms and spend time with your students. I don't know, I feel like I'm just going to give a bit of a commercial today, just in case somebody's missed this. But what we're talking about with ALC Bridge is introducing students to a real industry, and it's the language services industry. Latest figures show that we are at 69.3 billion globally. That was actually in 2023, and we're projected to be at 90.9 billion in 2027. This is in revenue produced by these services. So this is a very quiet, not well known, but actually growing industry that we have opportunities and jobs for you. Highly specialized translators can earn quite a bit of money, depending on how they use their approach to coming into the industry. The industry employs over 200,000 Americans full-time and over millions worldwide. This is according to NIMSY's reports. And we've grown 5 to 8% ever since 2005, making it a nice, steady, predictable growth economy. So today, we've chosen to introduce you to a piece that is, to me personally, extremely interesting and extremely intriguing, and that's localization in video games. And Jamie Cox is our speaker, and I'm not going to say anything else because Jamie is ready for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie.
I'm ready. Thanks,
You're
everybody.
ready. You are ready,
Appreciate it.
Jamie.
Thanks, ALC, and thanks, NYU, for having me. I really appreciate it. Yeah, my name is Jamie Cox. I am going to be talking about localization in video games. Um, I'll talk a little bit about my background during my presentation. Um, Hopefully you can see this all okay. But let me just go ahead and get started. All right, so first I want to talk about my background a little bit. I started out in the University of Montana. I'm from Montana, so I was getting my bachelor's degree there in Japanese, um, and that really allowed me a couple of great opportunities. I was able to study abroad at our sister school in Kumamoto, which was really great. Um, After that, I did a certification at a place called IUC, Inter-University Center for Japanese Studies in Yokohama. This is a consortium. This is an intensive language program that's done by a consortium of different colleges in the U.S. and Canada, um, and they basically just prime you for Japanese proficiency that gets you into further studies in academia or for the workplace or whatever it might be. Most of my cohort was students in doctorate programs, but there were people who were, international lawyers and were wanting to brush up their Japanese, for example. So it's a really great intensive language program. After that, I got my master's degree in Japanese at Portland State University. This was mostly Japanese literature, like post-World War II Japanese literature, but you learn the language kind of as you go along. and I was able to TA in Japanese classes as well, which was really great. After my MA, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I didn't think I really wanted more academia just yet, but I also didn't know what I could do with my degree. I didn't know that this, $69 billion, whatever it was, or like industry even existed. So I started asking friends what they were doing, and they said that they were doing some freelance translating. So I started at a company called Gengo as a freelance translator. And that was actually my first job. Once I was in there doing some of the translation, I also started doing project management as an intern. And that was my first taste of the localization industry. I was at Gengo for about 3 years. Started as an intern. Eventually, I was the project management lead. I led a team of about 6 different project managers all over the world um, in all of the work for Gengo. After Gengo, I went to a language service provider. I'll just call them LSPs now, called We Localize. We Localize is probably at the time, I think it was the seventh biggest LSP. I don't know if it's gotten bigger or smaller these days, but they were looking for someone who had a very like fast-paced, dynamic background, which Gengo really brought me for their Netflix account. So most of the work that I was doing on that account was not what you would think when I say Netflix localization. So we didn't do the subtitles or dubbing, but we did everything else. So the website, the help articles, the little descriptions of the shows that you see when you're watching Netflix, naming shows that didn't have names in the different languages. We Localize was doing at the time at least 12 different languages for Netflix, which was a pretty big chunk of their, 29 languages at the time. After that, I stayed at We Localize for another year doing quality program management. So mostly I was doing project management that whole time. The quality management is a really interesting sort of other side of the coin of production. Um, it's making sure that everything is the really high quality that it needs. There are different metrics for all those things. So that was pretty interesting. After that, I switched to United Language Group. This is another LSP, quite a bit smaller. They were located in Portland, Oregon, which is where I am too. So it was a good transition. I did a lot of work with like e-learning content, either what do you call that? Compliance e-learning, but I also worked with Subway doing e-learning for their what do they call them? Sandwich artists of all around the world. So that was pretty interesting too. After that, I shifted from the what we call the vendor side onto the client side. So my first job on the client side, which is working directly in a company doing localization for that company, was at Blizzard Entertainment. I was a localization producer there, pretty much the same as a project manager. They just call them producers to get in line with the rest of the naming conventions in the company. But the way it was done at Blizzard was it was a very big localization team, about 200. There were different linguists, there were different audio producers, and there were different producers as well. I'll talk about all the different roles that you can find in localization video games a bit later. But that was my focus. At Blizzard, how they split it up was there would be loc producers that were doing in-game localization, so the strings of the game, the audio in the game, those types of things. And then there were people who did what we called global content, which was my team, and that was everything else. So all the patch notes that you get in games, all of the cinematics that you see that Blizzard makes, any comic books, short stories, all the social media, that was all the team that I was on. And I was in charge of global publishing, which was doing all the social media content for all the different games, World of Warcraft, Overwatch, Diablo, all that, in all of the different languages. So great job. I was there for a couple of years. Decided I kind of wanted to do something on my own. So I started a job at BetterUp as a localization program manager. This was a big change. Not only it was outside of the gaming industry, but it was also going from a team of 200 different localization people to a team of one. I was the only localization person in a 600-person company, so that was a bit of a challenge. And I didn't know anything about digital coaching, which is what BetterUp does. But it was a really great place to sort of, cut my teeth and learn about how do you manage a localization program, which has really benefited me in my current role. I am back in video games very happily at a company called That's No Moon. Um, we're a very new studio. I think this is year 3 right now. I can't talk about what we're making because we haven't announced anything yet, but if you're interested in narrative-driven games, keep an eye out for us because that's sort of our jam. But yeah, I've been here about 3 year, no, about 3 months, and I am the only localization person here as well. So it's definitely exciting. That's my background. I want to talk about localization in games generally. So if you have played any of these games in English, then you have benefited already from localization and you didn't even know it, or maybe you did. But you've got like The Witcher, for example, that was originally in Polish. Rayman is French. Zelda, Final Fantasy, Elden Ring, all Japanese. Genshin Impact, I think, is Chinese. So there's all these different games that, even though they feel really good in English, generally, especially the more sort of recent you go, they weren't created that way. So you really have localization to thank for that. So why does localization matter? For me, there are a couple of reasons. One is sort of more human oriented, and the other sort of more capitalist oriented, I suppose. But for me, localization, it's a form of accessibility, right? The more languages you have a game in, the more players can enjoy this cool game that you have created or that you've had a part in creating. Um, most games that I see are typically localized in between 6 and 12 languages, which, when you think of all the languages in the world, is not huge, but it still opens the door for a lot of different people, which I think is really great. From a financial perspective, over half the biggest markets of gaming are in non-English speaking countries. So you can see here we've got China, Japan, South Korea, Germany, France, Italy. 6 of the top 10 are non-English speaking countries. And so by localizing your game, you are broadening the market and the market reach for that as well. Additionally, this isn't listed on this picture, but the largest growth sectors for games include non-English speaking countries. We've seen a big uptick in Thai localization, for example, Turkish, Polish, Arabic. These are all languages that typically in the past have not had a lot of game localization, but are increasing in the amount of games that are localized in that because there's a market growth opportunity there. So what I always say is that investing in localization is a money maker, not just a cost center. A cost center in the company is anything that attributes cost. So when you translate, you're paying a translator to do those translations. And so that is costing the company money. So it's easy for a company to look at that and say, like, well, why are we spending all this money? But there's a really good return on investment typically for localization. There's a research company called CSA that does research around localization, and they've estimated that for every dollar you invest in localization, you get about $25 back. Of course, this varies a lot, but that tends to be a very appealing metric for people. What's the impact of poorly localized games? Um, I don't know if anyone played the original Final Fantasy VII or if I'm just old, but you know, here's a good example of some poor localization. At best, poor localization can just be like funny, memeable anecdotes that add a little bit of levity, but at worst, it can lead to international ridicule of people not understanding your game, misunderstood instructions that prohibit further advancing in the game's progress, or immersion breaking experiences. Imagine you're watching a TV show in another language and you're reading the subtitles, and suddenly you get a subtitle that doesn't make a ton of sense, and you have to think about it for a second. It's the same with video games, except video games are a lot more immersive, and so you're being pulled out immediately, which can really break the experience. I want to talk a little bit about the localization workflow in video games now. One thing that you probably all know already is localization can't really start until the English or whatever the source language is locked. I always say it's a lot easier to make a change in one language than it is to make a change in a dozen languages. So it really behooves you and your own work to make sure that the content you get and you start translating is completely locked. By completely, I mean not completely because it will always change a little bit, but generally. You can break up the localization workflow into three different sections. There's pre-production, production, and then launch and post-launch work for localization. This is from my own experience. I'm sure that I'm missing some things, but generally, if we look into pre-production, you've got a lot to do. You have to choose which languages you're going to go into. There can be a lot of factors to consider here. For gaming specifically, a good thing to do is to look at the type of game you're creating and see how well those types of games perform in certain areas. Maybe you're making like a mobile game that sort of that has like gotcha elements to it, kind of like Genshin Impact. In that instance, you might want to look at where that has done the best historically, where people play games on cell phones more than on consoles or PCs. And generally, this is not something that a localization person will know readily, so you'll be working internally with other teams. You also want to look at font selection. I'll talk more about this on a separate slide, but you need to make sure that the font you're using works for every language that you've got, and that you're paying for that font if it's not a free one. Tool configuration. Uh, Most, if not all, games are created on a gaming engine. Sometimes those are proprietary engines that a game studio has created internally. Sometimes they are out of the box engines like Unreal, for example. It's a very popular one. But you need to make sure that whatever tool you are using for the game, uh, whatever tool, translation management system, whatever it might be that you're going to use for the translation, plays well with that engine. Um, Especially if it's a proprietary one, that can be a little bit more challenging. So you need to figure out not only the tool, but also the workflow. How are you going to get the translatable elements of the game out of the engine, and how are you going to get them back in? This involves not only text, but also audio if you are fully localizing your game with audio as well. So there's a lot of things to consider here. Um, you also need to think about what vendor you're going to use, what vendor or vendors. Are you going to hire an internal team of linguists? Is there enough work for that? Are you going to look outside at gaming specific LSP? Uh, how much do they cost? How quick are they? Do they have a project manager in your region who you can work with quickly? These are all elements to consider. Glossary creation. I think we all know that glossaries are very important for any translation project. They're especially important in games. Imagine you're calling like a spell or a certain class or something by one term, and then suddenly it's a different term because one translator translated it somewhere else. It can be very confusing for a player. So you want to make sure that everything is as consistent as possible and that that glossary in your workflow and in your tools is very easily accessible. You need to cast for audio as well. I'll talk about this on another slide too, but depending on the language, audio is typically expected or maybe not, but you need to make sure that whatever whatever feeling you're trying to evoke with a character and with their voice, that it's appropriately evoked and appropriately mirrored in those other languages according to the cultural standards there. Budget allocation is a big one too. You're probably not going to get the budget that you want to do absolutely everything. It's totally fine. You just need to figure out what you can do with the budget you have, and you need to have those expectations really known throughout the company as well. The last one is what's your international branding strategy? Are you going to have social media in every language for the game? Are you going to just have one thing in English and then maybe your website's localized? Or, what's the plan there? What sort of support do you have? Bigger studios will have regional marketing teams that can do, regional marketing blasts in different places. But not every studio has that. So it's important to know where your piece as the localization manager is going to be and how much you'll be required to do in that. Moving into production, this little bullet can take a very long time. Translation, right? You need to translate the entire game. Um, and it can be surprisingly challenging, even if you have a tool that scrapes your engine for every translatable string. For some reason, there will be strings that don't get captured and that you will need to find later on in your QA testing, which I'll talk about in a second. But and then the translation itself can take a very long time. Baldur's Gate 3, which is a recent game, I think, from last year, or maybe this year. Anyway, it has something like 2 million words, which is more than most book series altogether. So you can imagine that that takes a lot of time and a lot of money to translate. Localized VO recording. This can also take a very long time. I've got a separate slide to talk about this too, but depending on the type of localization VO you are doing, it can take a very long time and it can be very expensive. Query management, this is super important. You really want your linguists to ask as many questions as possible. You want to give them as much context as possible because that will ensure a better product, right? A better string. If they understand what the string means, it's going to be a lot better. So that's very important. You need to have a set way to get questions asked and to get them answered. Text and audio implementation into the engine. So this is the act of actually, once you've translated, how do you get that into the engine? You're probably not doing the translation directly in the engine. It's pretty messy to have all those different linguists working directly and something that could break very easily. So you want to make sure that you're figuring out a good pathway for that, which sort of rolls into the next thing of QA. So there's what we call functional QA or just QA, FQA. That's where a QA analyst, a QA tester gets into the game and tries every possible thing that any gamer might do, right? They try to run into all the walls to see if any break. They try to do, pretty much everything. Linguistic QA, LQA, is typically not that. There can be elements of that if they happen to find a functional bug, but mostly it's linguistic. So you want to see like, is a string too long and it's cutting off? Or is there a weird typo that's affecting something? Is the font showing up correctly? Is everything translated? That's a big one too. So linguistic QA is a very important step as well. You want to track milestones. You're going to be the one internally who cares the most about localization, but the whole company cares about it, whether or not they know it, right? So you need to make sure that you are tracking your own localization goals to milestones or goals that the company has set as well. Most game production happens in milestones, which is then split up into different sprints. So each of these milestones is going to have specific goals that everyone is working towards. Since localization happens so far at the end of the pipeline, you may not have those same goals, but you need to make sure that whatever goals you have are being clearly laid out for the rest of the company. You got website localization too. So, say you send out your announced trailer for the game and people are really excited and they go to your website. You want to make sure that whatever content you have that explains your game is localized into the languages that the game is going to be in as well, or whatever markets you're specifically targeting. So, that's a really key element there too. Lastly is launch and post-launch. You want to make sure that your marketing materials are localized. You may not localize everything into every language for marketing. There might be certain areas where you think the game's going to do really well, so you put your marketing localization budget into those areas instead. But again, you just want to make sure that whatever is expected of you is very clear. Social media post localization. Again, at Blizzard, we had every different game had, Overwatch Brazil or Diablo Japan or whatever it might be, right? It's not always the case, but you want to make sure that if something is being localized, that no one is secretly using Google Translate and not telling you. You want to monitor non-English media for feedback. So IGN, Kotaku, all those different game publishers, game news outlets, they will review your game probably, or they'll talk about your game. But so is every other language that the game has come out in. And your social media people, your marketing people, they're really going to like if you tell them how the game is faring reviews wise in these other languages as well. And typically, what's nice is if you're reading, um, a Japanese publisher or a Japanese game outlet about a review of the game, they'll probably talk about how the Japanese feels, and so you want to capture that information as well for any future iterating. There might be patches in the game that's additional, bug fixes or additional content or whatever it might be that goes into the game that you'll probably need to translate as well if it's new elements, right? Or even if an English string has changed, you'll probably need to change all the localized strings too. Local market initiatives. Um, Again, this is mostly a regional marketing team thing instead, but say the game's doing really well in France, and so they want to have a marketing campaign that shows up in the metro stations in Paris, right? You might be tasked with doing some of the localization there. Um, you probably won't be tasked with implementing that, but you'll be asked to do the translations. And you want to track user data metrics for success criteria. Um, Essentially that just means like what is the data that you can show to the company to say yes, the game did well, yes, it was worth this investment in localization. This is things like uh, it can be as easy as, hey, our game sold 1 million copies in Germany, and most people are probably playing in German, right? If you can't get that exact data for different privacy reasons or just data accessibility reasons, whatever it might be, if you can get the metrics of country and locale separate, that's really great. And it also informs, maybe another game's going to come out and you want to know where should we actually put our money this time, right? Um, Maybe there's a market where the game did really well that you didn't localize into that if you do localize, even more people will play, right? So this is very important data too. Okay, I feel like I'm talking so fast, apologies, but let's talk about localization audio. So this is a screenshot from God of War. I don't remember which one, but you can see here it says text language and speech language, and they are separate. There's a good reason for that. Um, it's to be able to be mixed and matched, right? So sometimes you want to hear the original voice actors, even if that's not your native language, but you still want subtitles to make sure you're understanding what they're saying, right? Maybe the English performance is just superior. I don't know, or maybe it's something, right? Maybe you're just used to it, depending on your region. So in certain areas, there's an expectation of full localization. This is historic, and maybe it's changing with younger people speaking English more generally. But French, German, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Brazil, these regions typically expect full localization in the game, meaning audio localization and text localization. On the other hand, there are certain areas where that's not necessarily the expectation, and text-only localization with English or other languages as a separate speech option is fine. This is places like Scandinavia, the Nordics, where the level of English is generally very high and the consumption of media tends to be subtitle only. Or places like places where they speak Turkish, which I guess is just Turkey, or Arabic, for example. These are places where, because game localization is pretty new, pretty nascent, they might not expect full localization, at least for now. Some games opt for made-up languages, so you can hear that in like Zelda sometimes or The Sims. This can really help cut down the cost of voice acting because you can use that same audio for every country. I think the only exception I can think of is Animal Crossing, where that's a fake language, but it's different in Japan as it is in the rest of the world. So that's interesting. There are a lot of challenges that come with audio localization. Imagine you have a 30-second cinematic. you can't extend the length of that cinematic because the language is longer, right? Or because it's shorter. You tend to be able to say things in Chinese a lot faster than in English, right? But it takes longer in German or in Portuguese to say the same thing. But your linguists need to work very skillfully at getting all of the necessary information into that same amount of time. Another thing they have to think of is matching the lip movement of the source, in my case, English, um, to what is being said. It's not always possible, but it's something that is typically strived for. And another thing is a lack of context for audio lines. Sometimes you'll see an audio line that's like a what you call a call out or a battle chatter that's called it's imagine it says like, oh, they're over there. Who is they? Is it one person? Is it a group of women, a group of men? All these things are going to affect the output of the translation, right? And so you need to make sure that people have as much context as possible when they're translating. Another thing to think about is font. There's a couple of different important elements in font. One is functional and one is creative. Most fonts don't support every language out of the box. Otherwise, they would be huge files, right? It's just not possible. So even though you might have one font that covers most not most Latin based languages, you're going to need to find different fonts for the non-Latin based character languages. So anything that's in Cyrillic or Korean or Japanese or Chinese, these are going to need different fonts that are representative of what you are showing in the game. I'll show an example in a second. Even with Latin character languages like Turkish and Polish, they might have special characters that whoever made the font didn't think of, like the little L with the line through it in Polish or the Turkish I. The Turkish I has caused me a lot of grief in my career. So, you need to make sure that the font you're using really can accommodate the languages you have. And from a creative perspective, the correct font helps evoke the right feeling for the in-game universe. You can see an example here. This is Animal Crossing in Japanese. The characters, they're very cute. They're like kind of chubby, right? Like they're a very good font for this sort of very cartoony world. Then you look at something like Elden Ring. These are both Japanese fonts, but they're very different. The one for Elden Ring is a little more like fantasy evoking. It's not cutesy at all. So it's not just a matter of does your font support the language, it's does the font support the world that you are building. One more element to think about is cultural adaptation and censorship. Um, Different regions have different types of censorship. Some of them are cultural and some are legal. And you, as the localization producer, you're not making that final call. These ratings boards are, but you can at least flag what might be an issue to the game producers. Um, so we have ESRB in the US. PEGI is, I think, an EU ratings board. USK is Germany. CERO is Japan. And they all have different ratings and they all have different rules. And so it can be very challenging. Most of the very common reasons that I see for censorship are things like excessive violence, blood, gambling, where that's not okay, alcohol use as well, LGBTQ plus themes where that is not allowed legally, sexual themes, religious themes. You see like blasphemy as a reason that games get censored quite often as well. For example, in China, this isn't really a hard and fast rule, but skulls and skeletons typically not allowed. And then in Japan, especially blood from like a humanoid character is not allowed. So sometimes it's swapped. Like in Diablo, I remember the blood had to be changed to like a dark black color instead of red from the demons, or else it would have been censored in Japan. Here's some examples from, I think, Fortnite, where you can see the original skin that is being sold for these characters versus what is available in the Chinese versions of these games. Usually, this anything like skull adjacent is going to be removed. Um, which also means you have different versions of the same game that is being sold in all these different regions. So it's a lot to keep track of. Generally, your purview as local manager is just making sure that people are aware that this might happen and that there are ways to work around that. Say you've got like a really violent cinematic that's in your game. Maybe you need to have a toned down version. Maybe you need to have a version that like cuts to black at certain instances. Like those types of things you have to think about. Let's talk a little bit about localization roles in the games industry. I think I've got 3 more slides left, so thanks everybody. The first one is producer. So that's like what I do. You manage daily production tasks. You're the point of contact for all things localization for the rest of the game team or the studio. Um, if a localization department is just one person, this tends to be the first hire. So you're not really looking at a globalization director as your first hire. You want someone who can just actually do the work, right? So loc producers, very common role that you'll see. This is similar to a program manager or something similar in other industries. We just typically call it a producer. Linguists, none of this could happen without the actual linguists who are doing the translation work. Um, so you typically work with a pair of translators, so a translator and an editor. This can be internal or external or some combination. It depends on how much content you have and what sort of markets are the most important for your game. Um, you also see something called language leads quite often. This is usually an internal hire that works with external vendors or external LSPs, and they're sort of the arbiter of quality for each language. They're managing the quality, they're making sure vendors are performing, that they're delivering on time, sort of like a vendor manager slash linguist role. Linguistic QA, again, it's different from functional QA. They test the localized builds and look for linguistic bugs. This can be internal. Sorry, my headphones cut off for some reason. You can hear me now, though, right? Great, thank you. So typically you'll see this as an external role. There are different gaming specific LSPs that have LQA team, and they'll be the ones that you'll be working with. So you need to figure out how are they going to tell you that a bug exists and how are you going to fix it. Regional marketing, I would say generally this tends to be more of a marketing role, but a linguistic background can be really, really helpful for this. Again, they're responsible for language specific marketing campaigns, whether physical or digital. And again, it's usually more of a marketing background, but you as a linguist might be tasked with providing the translations for these marketing campaigns. The last is a localization audio producer. If you're really into audio, this is a good role. It's basically an audio producer, but focused on the localized output. So they're making sure that the mixes are all right, the levels are all right. You can tell I don't know what goes into this role very much, but it's essentially audio for localization. What's really interesting too is a lot of localization audio producers I've seen or met don't actually speak all of the languages that they're working with. Same with a producer, right? Like I don't speak all these languages, but you are just listening for the levels. You're not listening for like what they're actually saying. You're just listening for the audio quality and that output. It's interesting. So you're interested now. You want to know how do you break into the games industry? Let's chat a little bit about that. I think the first thing to keep in mind is, like most industries, games have been hit pretty hard. Um, Gaming in general got a huge boost at the start of the pandemic when everyone was home. It was a lot of people were just like at home playing games, right? And so these studios really grew in size because they were getting a lot more money than they were used to. And now that's not as much the case. People are out of their house more. And so there's been a lot of adjustments to this new game industry reality between 2023 and 2024. 23,000 games jobs were cut. This is across all different industries within gaming, all different like disciplines within gaming. But something to keep in mind. I'm seeing a lot more roles coming out now, so I think we're sort of coming out of this a little bit, but little small indie studios are still getting shuttered. So I think Netflix just announced closure of their studio. So there's still a lot of volatility here. Just keep that in mind. That said, be vigilant. A lot of people I knew at Blizzard, for example, applied like 6, 7, 8 times for different jobs at Blizzard before they actually found a job that they were hired for. So if you apply somewhere and you don't get it the first time, don't lose hope. Don't write off the company. It's probably just a timing thing. So keep applying. You'll get it eventually. Another thing to consider for localization specifically is we're not the first uh, team that gets hired. Again, localization can't happen until you have actual content that's locked, and so you won't really see things for a while. With That's No Moon, we're in the third year, and they've finally hired, definitely not fired, a localization person. So if you're looking at a new studio and you're excited about what they might be building, maybe give them a couple years before they start looking for a localization person. A lot of loc roles are being outsourced. At bigger studios like Riot or Blizzard, it's not necessarily the case, but a company like mine, I can't expand my internal team, so I outsource a lot of work. So, especially if you're looking for linguistic work, there are a lot of game-focused, game-only LSPs that you can work with, whether as a linguist or an audio specialist or LQA, whatever it might be. If you do want to roll internally at a game studio, it is very common in my experience for people to start a job in one role and then transition to another role. In localization specifically, I knew a lot of people who were producers who started out maybe as local customer support specialists or LQA testers, those types of things, and then they transitioned and changed roles to being a producer. So if you can get a foot in the door and you can start somewhere, then eventually you can transfer to the department that you maybe wanted a little bit more. Another thing that I didn't put here is location. Um, I'm lucky enough to be working at a company that is sort of remote first, even though we have a studio in LA. That's not always the case. There are a lot of game studios in Southern California, Square, Sega, Blizzard, Riot, all these studios. So there are different concentrations of game studios, but there can be some remote opportunities as well. That was it. Thank you so much for your time. Hopefully, we've got some time for questions, but yeah, thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I tell you, that is like, whew. Uh, Annalise, I hope we have some questions.
Yeah, I would encourage everyone who's here to put forward your questions now. You're welcome either to come off of come on mic, or to enter your questions into the chat. Jamie, that was just really wonderful and inspirational. I think in another life I was an LQA tester or wanted to be one. This is just fantastic.
Good,
Um,
thank you.
yeah. And who would like to go? The first question's always the hardest, but I'm sure someone here has a question.
Hi, I don't know if you can hear me. I have a question. My name's Montiera.
Oh, Tiara,
Thank
I
you
can hear
so
you.
much. I appreciate the presentation. This was a lot of great information. So I had a couple of questions come and go, and they're kind of floating through my head, so bear with me. But I did hear your introduction of where you'd worked previously, but I guess kind of the space where I am, because I finished the translation and interpreting program a couple of years ago. I guess, how did you sort of find your footing and into this industry? I know that you said that you studied Japanese in undergrad and all of that, but how did you find your place? I guess is what I'm wondering.
Good question.
Yeah, great question. Yeah. For me, uh, what was really great about working at an LSP is that you have so many different clients that you get to have a taste of all these different types of content. So I knew people who were doing life sciences. I knew people who were doing legal content. I happened to be tasked with doing the media work and the tech stuff with Netflix. And then that experience helps me when I was applying for Blizzard because they were looking for a global publishing social media person. So I had that relevant experience. Um, so I think it is a matter of just figuring out like what do you like the most, and then trying to find a place that has that type of opportunity. LSPs are getting so specific in what they focus on that typically there's something out there that you can look for. And I would say for me it was a lot of luck as well, to be honest, like just having that experience and then having that specific role come up at the time. So I think timing is probably a big element of that as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Well, the
Montira.
student,
So we have a question in the chat from Carrie.
Oh yeah.
Jamie, in your experience, is there usually a high demand for Italian localization?
I would say yeah. Um, uh, Italy is, I think it was like the 10th biggest market for games generally. So it's pretty big. That coupled with at least from the data I've seen, I don't have any personal experience, but from the data I've seen, the level of English fluency is a little lower in Italy than in other countries around it. And so those two things combined means the demand for Italian in games is a lot higher. I will say what you're seeing a little bit more common these days is text translation gets done in Italian, but not necessarily the audio side. Um, just because there's a certain amount of the market that you need to penetrate, depending on how much the localization costs, right? Text translation is much cheaper than doing text and audio translation. So you'll probably see Italian as a language option for text at least, maybe not for audio, but I would say 90% of the time Italian is a language option.
great. So Jamie, while the students are thinking, I'm just wondering if you could help with suggestions as to how a student, a graduate student, can adjust to moving from the classroom into the workplace.
Yeah, good question. Um, I would say a lot of,
I know it's been a few years, but
yeah, I
think
know.
back, think back.
I know. I've been in localization for almost 12 years now, so it's been a
Incredible.
minute. But I would say a lot of the elements that make you a successful student will also make you a very successful project manager, program manager, producer. They're all kind of the same. Um, is like a really good attention to detail, being really well organized, um, knowing how to manage a workload, all of these things that you as a student are doing already, that's what you're probably going to need to do as a project manager or producer. So you already have the skills. It's just a matter of transferring them to, instead of what homework do you need to do, it's what translations need to get done this week as opposed to next week, right? It's all just juggling.
Thank you. I think that's right. And sort of in the same vein, just I'm wondering what experience do you have with freelancing in localization? I know freelancing is a major part of the industry for translators and interpreters. Do you have any comments as to freelancing and localization?
Yeah, I would say especially for linguists, freelancing is a lot more common. For me, I started in localization because I was doing translation, Japanese to English translation after my MA. Didn't know what else to do, so that was where I started. A lot of the linguists that I have worked with in the past either freelance and work part-time at a studio, or maybe they work full-time and still freelance, or maybe they just have a large group of different clients that they're all freelancing for. So yeah, I think again, it's about finding your niche. I'm connected with someone on LinkedIn who's like a sports translator. So as long as you can get a really specific, like, this is the work I do, you'll find clients, and you'll be able to have a really good career through freelancing.
Thank you, Jamie. And you've prompted me to talk about networking and how important it is in this industry. It's still a relatively small industry. We know each other. And so use the resources. LinkedIn is a very, very good one. Use resources to meet and greet, reach out to people in this industry. Language company owners are always interested in talking to the students that we work with through the ALC Bridge webinars. So use networking skills, and freelancing means that you're essentially working for yourself. And so you can find multiple clients, multiple companies to provide services with. And this is particularly important for some language groups. I mean, language companies just simply can't afford to bring on, full-time employment linguists and languages, even Hindi or languages where there's lesser demand. So you have to work for lots of different companies in different places. And that's what freelancing or self-employed, independent contracting are the words that you'll hear when you're out looking for positions. But don't say no, say yes.
Yeah, that's those are great points. I think even if it's hard, it's important to at least put yourself out there a little bit. It's the smallest $60 billion industry that you have heard of. So yeah, that said, I mean, feel free. I'm putting my LinkedIn in the chat, so feel free to add me there if anyone wants to. I'm always happy to connect and chat.
Wow, I'm sure a lot of our students today will take you up on that, Jamie.
Great.
This has been absolutely fantastic. We thank you for lending your time, your expertise so graciously to us today. I'm scanning, I don't see any last minute questions, but we have some thank yous coming in.
Thank
A
you.
warm round of applause to Jamie and to Kathleen for being with us today.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank
Thanks
you
for
so
having me.
much. Take care.
Take
Thank you.
care.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Bye all.
Bye.